In the mist-shrouded fields of early 18th century County Antrim in the province of Ulster, the 1711 witch trials of Islandmagee unfolded not merely as a clash between the accuser and the accused, but as a collision of ancient traditions, colonial powers, and clashing worldviews. To understand this pivotal moment, we must first journey into the heart of Celtic folk culture, a world where healers communed with spirits, keeners bridged the living and the dead, and fairy doctors negotiated with invisible supernatural forces. These were the traditional mystic folk that were all loosely referred to in Ireland as witches. Welcome to part 1 of Storyteller's Hearth Fireside Tales 4-part series on the Islandmagee Witch Trials of 1711. In part 1, Faith, Fear and the Law, we visit the cultural, religious and legal backdrop of Ulster at the time of the trials. If you enjoy these subjects the way we do and how we present them, and want to see more, please like and subscribe to encourage us. The wise women called Mná Feasa were the traditional healers, often stemming from well-known hereditary folk healing families. They were typically trained from a young age on plant medicines, physical manipulation, charms, incantations, and healing rituals. A wise woman's reputation often rested not only on her esoteric herbal concocting skills, but also upon her second sight that might today be called clairvoyance or remote viewing, giving her a seemingly otherworldly ability to diagnose ailments, foresee and avoid misfortune, and know what other people were doing or what was situated at a location several miles away. These second sight abilities might be supported by a familiar spirit in the form of an animal or even a proverbial fly on the wall. A successful wise woman or Mná Feasa, singular for Mná Feasa, could become a folk hero, revered in her rural community for the efficacy of her cures. By the 18th century, these wise women or cunning folk regularly clashed with powerful colonial landlords, Catholic and Protestant clergy alike, medical doctors and civic authorities. In doing so, they were seen by the underclasses as symbols of their resistance against encroaching civil and religious authorities, and were celebrated as keepers of Ireland's ancient mystical knowledge. Another class of witches were the keeners, Mná Caointe, who were the masters of sacred grief and usually worked in groups of 3 women. At funerals, these women, often described as barefoot and wild-haired, led mourners in noisy laments, clapping, rocking corpses, and improvised poetic wails to guide souls into the otherworld. Their rituals, rooted in pre-Christian bardic traditions, were viewed as acts of communal catharsis and were ways of helping society grieve. These women took on the role of a psychopomp or soul conductors, acting as benevolent guides assisting the spirit of the newly deceased navigate into the afterlife by surrounding the dead body in a cacophony of sound. Mná Caointe, who were also believed to have the ability to shapeshift, might unexpectedly appear to the bereaved as crows, hares, old hags, or other apparitions, and frequently doubled as midwives when not keening, cementing their position as indispensable members of their neighborhood. Initially mildly condemned by early Catholic missionaries for their heathenish conduct during wakes, keeners were eventually officially discouraged at the Provincial Synod of Armagh convened in 1632, when they made a fierce verbal attack against sorcery, magic, demonic pacts, fortune-telling, and the practice of superstitious prayers. Ecclesiastical authorities increasingly censured traditional Irish mourning rituals, particularly the role of keeners and raucous wake customs, as part of broader Counter-Reformation reform efforts. The 1676 Synod of Waterford and Lismore condemned the prevalence of drinking and frivolous storytelling at funerals, framing them as incompatible with solemn Christian observance. The 1686 Provincial Synod of Dublin ordered parish priests to penalise those who sang vulgar songs during wakes, explicitly forbidding buffoonery that dishonours the memory of the dead. In the 1670 Provincial Synod of Armagh, funeral attendance was restricted to immediate family and close friends, aiming to curb the drunkenness and communal chaos associated with large bibulous gatherings. By the 18th century, the Catholic Church, and to a lesser extent, the Anglican establishment, viewed these rituals as threats to doctrinal discipline and orthodox piety. Strict prohibitions were enforced against alcohol consumption, communal storytelling, competitive games, dancing, and improvised lament poetry during vigils. The once vibrant keening tradition, with its fusion of grief and festivity, was systematically marginalized, replaced by silent prayer and scriptural readings. This crackdown reflected both theological rigor and colonial disdain for Gaelic culture, as Ireland's religious hierarchies sought to align with European norms of decorum, while suppressing indigenous expressions of mourning. From 1614 until the 1800s, Catholic priests systematically hunted down, excommunicated, and whipped keening women, while anyone caught attending their barbaric funeral events risked being barred from the sacraments and severed from the congregation's fellowship. Despite the theological rigor introduced by the Church's Tridentine reforms, the Mná Caointe secretly persisted by introducing hybrid practices of incorporating Christian prayers and rosaries into the rituals that somewhat placated the priests, while maintaining the essence of their traditions. Although the Church's draconian measures slowed the practice of keening, they failed to completely eradicate them, which only deepened the divide between clergy zealots and the laity. Particularly in isolated rural areas, it became commonly believed priests were merely protecting their exclusive roles in performing funeral rites, echoing tensions that are rumoured to even persist to this day in these remote areas. The priests' growing, sometimes ruthless suppression of traditional remedies and ceremonies inspired the mantra, high money, high mass, low money, low mass, no money, no mass. English Protestant authorities were no less suspicious of wakes. They believed these large Catholic Irish gatherings, to which they were largely excluded, could be used as covers for subversive political meetings or for disseminating rebellious anti-landlord or anti-colonial ideas. Yet another class of people who fell under the general description of witches or wizards were the fairy doctors, or Lucht Shee in Irish, who were the negotiators with the unseen. They were men or women specializing in identifying changelings, reversing fairy magic that prevented milk from churning into butter, detecting the source of human or livestock ailments and abnormalities such as milk cows drying up, and many other problems caused by the East Shee, or fairy magic. Lucht Shee most commonly used iron items such as horseshoes, holy water, and rowan wood to break the fairy curses or recover stolen children, livestock, or possessions. Since their powers often came after a reported supernatural encounter with the fairies at a ring fort or fairy tree, or even going away with them, which was an euphemism for either being abducted by or voluntarily eloping with the fairies. These fairy doctors' liminal rites drew suspicion and nervousness from many in their neighbourhoods that they might be in collusion with the Shee, who might be used as familial spirits. While some saw them as healers, others believed fairy doctors walked an uneasy, if not dangerous line, between healing and collusion with the otherworld, and blurred the line between saviour and sorcerer. For the church, things were much clearer. In their eyes, these witches derived their ungodly power from the devil and his demons as a result of a pact made between the fairy doctor and Lucifer. Small itinerant Romani communities or individuals travelled through Ireland in the 18th century, often working as tinkers, musicians, or peddlers. Their nomadic lifestyle, distinct customs, and perceived foreignness fueled suspicion with the locals. The Romani were viewed as outsider transients with mysterious or dangerous powers and reputations for stealing anything that was not nailed down. Renowned for palm reading, fortune-telling, and horse trading, their image aligned with Irish folk beliefs of magical strangers who spoke an unintelligible language of either Romani or the unrelated Hiberno-English cryptolect, or secret language called shelter. In Irish tradition, curses or maledictions were deeply feared, and the gypsy curse was one of the most dreaded. Although curses could be cast by fairy doctors, cunning folk, or even priests, those of the marginalized gypsy outsiders were convenient scapegoats to blame for unexplained misfortunes such as illness, crop failure, livestock deaths that happened after a hostile encounter with a gypsy, or was concurrent with the appearance of a Romani family camping in the neighborhood. If a Romani person was denied charity, perceived fair payment for their tinkering, or hospitality for themselves or their animals, locals might blame subsequent misfortunes on a retaliatory curse. Wronged gypsies were infamously known for casting on the offender's family. Many people believed gypsies used begging as a clandestine means of casing the property, while intending to return when the family were out. For this reason, many people refused to provide alms to gypsies and would speak harshly to have them go away. This type of encounter sometimes resulted in a barrage of threats that would later be attributed to a death in the family or some other disaster. Often a terrified family burdened with a gypsy's curse might seek the help of a fairy doctor or priest to perform counter-rituals, such as burying eggs at crossroads, burning certain herbs, or reciting appropriate prayers. These acts restored a sense of control over the feeling of helplessness from a perceived supernatural threat. Tales of Romani curses became so common, they entered Irish oral tradition, blending with older myths about magical strangers. These stories told of financial ruin or increased unexpected mortality and acted as warnings against mistreating outsiders, especially gypsy beggar women. Maybe the real magic was that fewer people were brave enough to refuse a gypsy's request for alms. The attitudes of the Anglican clergy were much more in line with their brethren in England, who by the 18th century were beginning to dismiss traditional witchcraft beliefs as being superstition or fraud, and who had not executed a witch since 1682. They believed the witches that were not involved in deliberate trickery were merely mentally ill or delusional. Presbyterians, on the other hand, were influenced by their Scottish roots that also had a rich tradition of wise women who played complex roles in rural communities, blending folk healing, midwifery, and supernatural practices. This culture had coexisted uneasily with Scotland's notorious witch hunts, as wise women could be both respected and feared. Spaewives were female fortune-tellers in Scottish and Northern English folklore, akin to wise women or cunning folk that interpreted dreams, read omens using stones and crystals, and offered remedies. Spaewives treated illnesses with herbal remedies such as rowan and charms for protection and yarrow for wounds. They also assisted with childbirth and protected mothers and their infants from evil spirits, and provided protection against curses, the evil eye, or fairy interference, using iron charms. Many became valued members of society and were paid in food or goods for their services. Stories about famous Scottish witches like Bessie Dunlop still circulated. These witches' knowledge of nature and the supernatural was seen as vital by their communities. Yet, if their remedies failed, or if they feuded with neighbours, they risked being labelled witches. The same skills that earned respect could also attract suspicion. Some living in 1711 might have even followed the trial in 1662 of Isabel Godey, when she described shape-shifting and using curses and other fantastical elements. During the 18th century, rural Irish Presbyterian communities still widely believed in the ability of witches' curses to cause crop failures and affect the health of people and livestock. This belief in folk magic coexisted uneasily with many rural Presbyterians. While in Scotland, deific ministers like the Reverend Robert Wadrow fervently preached against witches, framing them as moral threats, and the Scottish Kirk sessions continued to actively investigate accusations. Yet some less fiery ministers in rural backwaters tacitly tolerated white witchcraft if it served communal needs and did no apparent harm. Historically, familiar spirits were not domesticated animals, but supernatural entities believed to assist witches and cunning folk as magical aids in occult practices. According to trial records from the witch-hunting era, these spirits, fairies, demons, or sometimes ancestral shade, often said to be bestowed by the devil, entered into formal agreements with their human counterparts. These pacts outlined reciprocal obligations. The spirit provided magical aid, while the witch performed specific rituals or offerings. Familiars could shapeshift, appearing as cats, hares, spiders, owls, crows, rats, humans, or even spectral forms, shadows and mists. A witch's familiar spirit was envisioned as a supernatural ally that supported her magical practices, enhancing her craft through collaboration. This entity was thought to act as a conduit, venturing beyond the witch's immediate surroundings to collect knowledge and insights, effectively extending her awareness through its own perceptions. Beyond reconnaissance, familiars also actively participated in spell work, transforming the witch's intentions into tangible outcomes by channeling energy or manipulating unseen forces. In magical traditions, practitioners sometimes compelled spirits into service through ritualistic agreements, inscribed symbols, or enchanted restraints. These entities were not always willing participants. They might be summoned against their will using intricate knotwork, knotted cords, or woven talismans designed to constrain their power. Crafts like braiding hair, stitching fabrics, or interlacing threads carried intentional weight in these rituals, transforming everyday acts into methods of spiritual control. The act of binding, whether through physical knots or symbolic gestures, served as a bridge between the mundane and the mystical, merging creation with containment. Historical accounts describe witches and cunning folk allegedly using binding rituals to influence others, ranging from coercive love spells intended to manipulate affection to harmful curses. These practices often involve knotting ribbons, cords, or strings, while incorporating personal items such as hair or clothing belonging to the target were believed to magically bind their will, health, or fate. Such rituals were rooted in folk magic traditions, where knots symbolized control and entanglement. Early Irish Christianity had absorbed pagan rites such as holy wells and St. Bridget's crosses. they has rebranded sacred sites like pagan wells with saints' names, which then became places of Christian pilgrimage, while native defiance endured. Rural communities depended on these witches for healing, protection from fairies, and funeral rites. They filled gaps left by absent or prohibitively expensive medical and religious services. Witches were seen as the guardians of folk tradition and Irish identity, and were comforting symbols of continuity from their past that bound the community together under colonial oppression. By the early 18th century, the Church of Ireland elites, whose time had come on the heels of the Glorious Revolution, and whose adherents were in the flush of the victory of the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, were beginning to dismiss witchcraft as mere Presbyterian and Catholic hysteria. Enlightened English thinkers such as John Locke had emphasized reason and empirical inquiry, which began to be selectively adopted into Anglican theology. He had stressed the importance of tolerance, especially in matters of religion. As a result, some clergy were starting to espouse a more latitudinarian approach, prioritizing moral philosophy over doctrinal rigidity. Nevertheless, the Anglican Church in Ireland's focus still remained on liturgical conformity, anti-Catholicism, and anti-Presbyterianism, and less on Enlightenment innovation. William King, the Church of Ireland's Archbishop of Dublin, in advocating blending reason with orthodoxy, directed the Church to reject deist challenges to revelation, clearly repudiating radical critiques of doctrine. John Toland, an Irish rationalist philosopher and freethinker who had converted to Protestantism as a boy of 16 and changed his name to John, had narrowly escaped execution by burning after publishing his incendiary work, Christianity Not Mysterious, in 1697. Forced to flee Ireland to England, Holland, and Germany after being condemned by members of the Irish Parliament, whom he described as being no better than popish inquisitors. His case lingered as a chilling reminder to Irish theologians of the peril faced by Enlightenment thinkers who challenged orthodox dogma. Some prominent Anglo-Irish theologians, such as Jonathan Swift, who in 1713 became Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, defended traditional thought, arguing against and even mocking the Enlightenment movement. Since Swift had attended Kilkenny School from the age of 6, he would have been very familiar with the famous Kilkenny Witch Trials of 1324. See our video entitled The Irish Inquisition. It wasn't until well after our witch trials that the Enlightenment's fuller impact would emerge, when Edmund Burke, who was raised Anglican in Ireland, finally bridged reason with tradition. In 1711, the Presbyterian community in Ireland, particularly in Antrim, where they formed a demographic majority, held a rigorous, biblically grounded belief in witchcraft, shaped by Calvinist theology, socio-political marginalization under the penal laws, and a covenantal worldview. This stance clashed sharply with the skepticism of the Anglican elites. The memory of the blood of the Scottish Covenanter martyrs during their resistance to enforced royal and episcopal control over the Scottish Presbyterian Church up until 1685 was still fresh in their psyche, and indeed in many memories. Presbyterian theology adhered strictly to Exodus 22:18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," viewing witchcraft as a grave sin requiring communal purgation. It was believed to be a pact with Satan that threatened the spiritual purity of the entire church congregation. Presbyterians believed God's favor depended on the community's adherence to divine law, and witchcraft, as a breach of that covenant, invited God's wrath, which might manifest as crop failures or plague within the community. Witch trials, to them, were not just legal acts, but moral, biblically mandated imperatives to restore God's blessing. The Paisley Witch Trials of 1697, where 7 were burned, exemplified this Scotland's fervor. But by 1710, such mass trials had become less common, but local hunts still persisted in the Highlands and Islands. As dissenters, Presbyterians faced severe legal discrimination, such as being barred from public office, not having their marriages legally recognized, and, importantly in this case, prohibited from sitting on juries. This fostered a siege mentality within their meeting houses, heightening their vigilance against internal and external threats. By 1711, Irish Presbyterians' attitudes toward witchcraft and fairycraft had become a blend of Calvinist rigor, colonial insecurity, and their cultural inheritance from Scotland. The educated classes had syncretized elements of fairy magic and the practices of traditional cunning folk, which they equated with demonology, yet paradoxically preserved some age-old fairy doctor customs, such as crafting herbal charms from rowan and other herbs, or hammering iron nails or horseshoes onto thresholds to repel demons. Their push for conviction in the Islandmagee trials reflected not just a fear of the occult, but a broader struggle to preserve their identity and agency in a society that marginalized them. This episode underscores how witch hunts could serve as both spiritual crusades and political tools in early modern Ireland's fractured landscape. The 1586 Irish Witchcraft Act had targeted cunning folk as it turned wise women, keeners, and fairy doctors into heretics, charmers, and witches. Passed under Queen Elizabeth I during the Tudor conquest of Ireland, the Act was part of broader efforts to consolidate English control and suppress Gaelic culture, aimed at Anglicizing Ireland by eradicating indigenous practices, including traditional healing and fairy lore that were seen as threats to Anglican English rule. The Act classified witchcraft as a felony, which was punishable by death for first offences that involved maleficium or magic that caused harm to others, bypassing England's 1563 Act, which allowed for 3 strikes, in addition to malevolent spells, curses, and other supernatural acts intended to inflict damage on individuals, their families, crops, or livestock. The prohibition against diabolism broadened the scope to include traditional Irish practices of wise women and fairy doctors. The law included vague terms like witchcraft, sorcery, or charm to allow for the prosecution of folk healers and Gaelic rituals, conflating them with diabolical witchcraft. After the passing of the English Witchcraft Act in 1604, the definitions of witchcraft were further expanded to include summoning spirits and consorting with familiars. The Witchcraft Act was more than a legal statute. It was a weapon of cultural imperialism. By criminalizing indigenous practices and empowering the Crown, it advanced Tudor and later Stuart aims to Anglicize Ireland, leaving a legacy of persecution that shaped Irish society until it was replaced in 1735 by the British Witchcraft Act, which reclassified witchcraft accusations as fraud and remained on the books until 1983. Irish grand juries comprised from between 12 and 23 elite members of the Anglican county society, frequently representing the most influential factions. Unlike English juries, they did not examine witnesses directly, but instead relied on their assessment of draft bills of indictment to determine whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial. If they deemed the evidence sufficient, a billa vera, or true bill, was issued, formally charging the accused and compelling them to face arraignment. This is the end of Part 1 of the Islandmagee Witch Trials of 1711. in which we visited the cultural, religious and legal backdrop of Ulster at the time of the trials. In Part 2, coming in December, we will witness the supernatural events as they occur and follow how, through stringent detective work, the witches were identified. We show how a local professional family for months endured sustained psychological trauma by unseen hands that left them physically exhausted, emotionally shattered, and socially isolated. Yet the accused lost more. I will leave a link to Part 2 in the description once it is out. Please take the time to like this video, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel to encourage us to make more. Since YouTube promotes videos based on the numbers of their subscribers, we need your help to get it out there. Thank you.